And then we have some educator camps for you educators. I heard that whispering. Those are partially grant funded, so I would encourage you to check those out. I think I recognize you. You've done some camps with us before. So the tremendous one, July 17th through the 18th, there's 8 spots left on that. So check those out. There's also Mad Trivia coming up on June 30th, and also WASDN outing. So if you've heard of our WASDN collection, that is a fun adventure to see where all the artifacts are dug up. So anyway, I talk fast. I'll try and talk slow. It is my pleasure today to welcome Kurt Ikeda here. He's the Director of Interpretation and Education at Minidoka National Historic Site. Sorry. Kurt is a second-generation Japanese-American educator, and he's a descendant of World War II incarceration survivors. He previously served as the education specialist for the Southern Idaho Parks and as a Northwest Youth Corps intern for Minidoka in 2018. Prior to the National Park Service, he worked at the Japanese American Museum of Oregon, OCA Asian Pacific American Advocates, and as a high school English teacher, God bless you, through Teach for America. Kurt received his BA from University of California, LA, and his MA in Urban Education, Educational Policy, and Administration from Loyola Marymount University. He was raised in the Asian American communities of LA, and he now resides in Twin Falls with his lovely wife, April. His mission is to preserve the legacy of the unjust World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans through education, poetry, and community building. And that is why he's here today. So welcome, Kurt Ikeda. Oh, I need to give you this. Yeah. Everyone pay attention. Yes. Oh, it's blocked.
Oh, it's blocked. It's blocked.
No lock.
Yeah, no government secrets today, folks.
Except I thought that. So
Just in the pocket, is that fine right here? All right. Well, that's a fantastic introduction. Thank you so much. And welcome, folks. I'm really happy to be spending the next about hour with you. I'm so excited to spend the next hour with you that I'm going to let myself, who's already recorded, talk to you instead. So I'm going to start off with this little introduction of the park, and then we'll get into the actual presentation. How many of you have been to Minidoka National Historic Site before? Well, then why are you all here today? You already heard me talk. But if you haven't been here before, I'm going to be showing you a quick little sizzle reel, as I like to say in the movie industry, that shows off a little bit of what you can expect when you come here. And for the folks who haven't been here since we've opened the new visitor center, a little sneak peek into what that visitor center experience is like as well. So let me start that video, and then we'll do a little presentation. And we'll have another chance to watch a specific video about the power of words and how we use to describe this experience. That's found in that book you have on your knee right there, sir, like The Face of the Mountain. And obviously, I'll go into a nice Q&A where you could try to stump the ranger and make me feel bad about myself if I don't know all the history. I'm really happy you're here, and let myself talk to you all for a little bit. And since I missed, oh, there we go. I was gonna make an internet joke, but here we are.
Minidoka National Historic Site in Rome, Idaho. That tells the story of over 13,000 people of Japanese ancestry who were forced to leave their homes and incarcerated here in World War II. This is not just an American issue, but also an Idaho issue. Minidoka Education Center during World War II was what they call the 7th largest city by population, double the size of Jerome County. When you think about those population numbers, sometimes forget that 140 buildings that were here. You're not going to be able to hear the footsteps and the stories of over 30
Should have given me a daytime Emmy for that performance right there. And they said, yeah, we'll give you multiple chances to record, and they only gave you one shot, so that's what you got. Howdy, folks. My name is Kurt Ikeda. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a director of interpretation, what they used to call a chief of interpretation here at Minidoka National Historic Site in Jerome County. Very happy to have driven the 2.5 hours to come out to see you all while we're having the opportunity to talk about this important history. I'm a former teacher, so I like to start off with what we call an into activity. And as you focus on this kind of small image right here, obviously you know what talk you're here for, so it's kind of a moot point. But nonetheless, I want you to entertain me for a second. When you look at this picture, obviously, what's the first thing that comes to your eyes? Children, right? Kind of basing off this understanding, you see children probably in some sort of, well, gosh, looks like a soldier costume of some sort, but definitely in some sort of probably historic garb. It's black and white. You could probably guess an old photo. But if we zoom out a little bit more, then you can understand these folks are probably walking down somewhere. They're walking down, it looks like maybe some sort of cobblestone, maybe not cobblestone. There's rocks on the side and a little bit of dirt pathing almost is what I could kind of focus on this end. But they're not surrounded by people. It's just two little kids. If we go even farther out, then we see that they're walking not just within a place that has dirt and rocks along the way, but you also see rows and rows of barracks, of army barracks. Some of you may have family, you yourself may have served in our US military. You may have a personal understanding of what life is like inside one of these army barracks. And that is exactly what that lived experience was, except the fact of the matter is, these two children, aged somewhere between 3, if not 4, if not 5, didn't go here by choice, right? Did not have the choices, or frankly, probably did not even fully understand the circumstances of which they were living in a place like this. Some of you may have been alive during World War II. And if you are, man, you all look really, really good. There's a handful of folks who we call Minidoka survivors even today who continue to tell the story, whether they're actually in Twin Falls. We have one fantastic survivor, Karen, who grew up, I was actually born in this camp as one of the first babies who were born in Minidoka and grew up in Idaho and continues to tell this story. And whether they're in Washington or Oregon or California, this story is held by those survivors who are more likely the age of these children. And the way that we all continue to remember history is put through the specific lens of who we're talking to. And today we're going to be seeing a little bit more of that complexity of this experience, whether it is through the World War II veterans, the 442nd, or whether it's through the eyes of these young kids who probably didn't know any different in their experiences. But as we talk about this, I wanted to put all of this into context. In the aftermath of December 7th, 1941, you have headlines like this in the Idaho Statesman. As you can see, this is actually exactly on the morning of December 7th. And I'm not going to repeat this word over here on the very top left, but you could probably say it says Japanese Americans bomb both Hawaii and the Philippine Islands. And this news is now entering into the understanding of local Idahoans. And if I were to ask you, right, back in 1941, going into 42, why this incarceration had to happen, 3 general reasons are given, right? Especially back in the 40s. We're doing this for their own good. We can't be certain of the loyalty, and the enemy isn't welcome. Right? My hope is by the end of today's talk, these aren't the 3 reasons that you're going to be going back to your book club and talking about why this happened, but we'll be able to have a more complex understanding of really, truly why this is the case and why these 3 statements are complete myths. And I think the best way to bust a myth is to actually give you an understanding of what the words were like back in 1942, whether it's John McCloy, the Assistant Secretary of War. These people are not internees. They are under no suspicion for the most part, and were moved largely because we felt we could not control our own white citizens in California, right? And this understanding is specifically given from the War Department, saying there was no need, but we're doing this for their own good because we can't trust the folks who might do some harm to them. But that's a myth we'll bust in a bit. We can't be certain of loyalty. I know you kind of see it already, but I know we have some young folks in this crowd here. And if you had to recognize this artist, who does this artist remind you of? Yeah, Theodore Geisel, Dr. Seuss. And Dr. Seuss was known for having a variety of very racist cartoons and propaganda pieces, especially in the 30s and 40s, which was, as surprising as this looks right now, the general feeling of our country at that time. And here reflected, we have this notion of a 5th column, whether it's from the West Coast, Washington, Oregon, and California, but these buck-eyed, right, circular glasses, slant-eyed, almost like a conglomerate of people, right? There's no individuality in this, taking TNT in this photo and looking towards the east with the statement that says, waiting for a signal from home. This racist notion that we can't be certain of their loyalty. And last but not least, this very obvious piece that the enemy isn't welcome here. This is Governor Chase Clark in 1942 of Idaho. He has a very famous quote, and once again, I'll say the full phrase, but not the slur. Japanese Americans, he says, live like rats, breathe like rats, and act like rats. I won't take any of them in Idaho except under guard and confined in concentration camps. The theme of today's talk is actually going to be on the power of words. And I want you all to remember the fact that in 1942, our own governor of this state specifically used the term concentration camp. And we could take a little bit more time, especially in Q&A, to discuss why that terminology is so important. I'll bring you another example from the President of the United States in 1942 when he signed Executive Order 9066 as a press conference. He says, Mr. President, will some of the Mexicans replace the Japanese in truck gardens in California? The president answers that I don't know. Then he's asked, where did the Japanese come from? We're being shipped off to Montana, sir. And then President Roosevelt responds back once again, concentration camps. How many of you learned about this story and this history as the internment? As the internment. I did also, growing up. I first heard about this story. It's not really a story that I heard about the legacy of my family back in the 4th grade. I remember reading this book called The Farewell to Manzanar. Some of you may be familiar with, and it was in 4th grade. And I remember I went home to my grandma and my grandpa. My grandpa did not know anything about the 40s, let alone what his youth was like, because you're a 10th grader, a 10-year-old. You don't really care about anybody but yourself when you're 10 years old. And I recall asking my grandfather, where was he in 1942? Because that was the assignment, of course. And my grandmother pulls me aside. And she says, we don't talk about that here in this household. So I learned about the internment of Japanese Americans. And a few years later, I realized the word internment actually means that you are taking a population of people who are not citizens and in a time of war, putting them behind barbed wire or putting them inside some sort of camp. You intern people who are non-citizens. But I realized my grandfather was a citizen. He was born here. And I suddenly realized that the terminology we've been using to describe this history is in and of itself deeply problematic and deeply racist. And my only thesis of today's conversation is if I could help this group of people here in Idaho Falls, recognizing that also Idaho Falls had approximately 200 plus Japanese Americans right around 1942 who were not subjected to the same incarceration. I'm going to encourage us as a community, and I think we all could agree Idaho Falls is a community, to be able to use language that doesn't hide the reality of this history, but more so places it at its forefront. So with that said, folks, I'm going to show a quick 7-minute video, and then I'll go into my rest of my presentation, as I want to present to you this idea of the power of words. And this short film is going to explain the euphemisms used during World War II and how these phrases did not match the reality and, frankly, harm Japanese Americans in our understanding of the war today. And just to get a pulse check, are you all having a good time? Is this a good And for folks who are interested, we have a few more videos that are short, and even I think for a good fourth grade class could kind of give a better understanding and context to some of those complexities, whether it's things like patriotism and protests, right? Understanding the fact that over 1,000 men and women served from Minidoka bravely. At the same time, we had folks who resisted the draft on the very strong sense that, yeah, sure, I'll serve if you give me my rights back. And that dichotomy, what it meant to the community, obviously just watched power of words, the power of the press, which, as we all saw in the Dr. Seuss political cartoon or the Idaho Statesman, the strong notion that the way the press would create this sense of propaganda could continue, right, to control how one person might understand the incarceration happening. At the same time, a very small case of allyship in a small place called Bainbridge Island, where a specific newspaper was the only newspaper that put out positive statements towards Japanese Americans on a large scale. That's in the news, of course. And last but not least, standing up for others. I think a lot of you are here because you care not just about history, but also how we as a country continue to learn from that history. Kim and I had a wonderful conversation today about how this story of Minidoka and World War II incarceration has lessons, and how we treat our neighbors and how we treat ourselves as American citizens. And this idea of standing up for others is one I think that our members here who are joining us from the Idaho Falls or Pocatello Blackfoot Japanese American Citizens League can agree. That's why this important story is something we need to still tell. So once again, as folks are interested in that, this is called betrayedfilm.com. We also have a 60-minute version that was played locally on PBS. And if you're interested in that, you can always hit up that website as well. So I wanted to address probably the big elephant in the room here, which is probably, well, Ranger Kurt, if you're telling me here that I've been saying the wrong thing for the past, gosh, I don't know, 40 plus years, what should I say? Well, here you go. The answer is right there. Take a picture of it. It's helpful. As you all heard, the word Japanese relocation sounds like you're taking folks out of a natural disaster. And as Frank Abe said, this is a man-made disaster. So we highly encourage, as a National Park Service, the Japanese American incarceration as an alternative. Evacuation to forced removal, internee to survivor, and of course, internment camps to concentration camps. Now, if I say the word concentration camp, what's the first thing that comes to mind for you? Right. Well, some folks may call the Holocaust, or if you're understanding it from the perspective of Jewish peoples, the Shoah. And yet, I want to have you consider the fact that what if we're using words like concentration camp to describe a place like Dachau, where we all can deeply understand, though it was subsection into various places, the general idea of a place like Dachau may actually not be to concentrate people, but the pure notion to kill systematically. And I think a term like death center, which has been used in various places of Jewish American education, may just be something we want to consider in our own vernacular. But of course, for the folks who are looking for where's the proof in the pudding, in 1998, the Japanese American National Museum and the American Jewish community came together to a consensus. Now, the term concentration camp, using that to describe what happens in 1942 in America, does not minimize the experience of Jewish people, as well as LGBTQ folks, as well as various other people like the Romanis who are persecuted and systematically killed. It doesn't minimize that experience. It just forces all of us to look at history with a more brighter light of reality. Now, why do I care so much about this? I care so much about this because I'm wearing the same badge of the same government of the same people who incarcerated my grandfather when he was 8 years old. And I wouldn't be surprised if some folks here today who are joining us either has or had a friend or a family member who was affected by this incarceration experience. And in fact, I'd love to see by a show of hands, how many of you are joining us today who knew somebody or knows somebody who was affected by this experience? I see some hands right there in the back, a few more. I see at least 20 hands going up in the air. And I can imagine for the folks who raised your hand, as I discussed this history, or as you saw the accounts of the survivors, how this might bring up some memories and feelings for you of these people and how they process this traumatic experience. The National Park Service put out a white paper, which is more or less an official statement about how we will continue to move forward in telling this story, with the specific goal of the American government ran, operated, and duly incarcerated over 125,000 people of Japanese ancestry, and for 40 years up until 1988, did not take appropriate action to be able to remedy this case. And therefore, in doing so, we today in 2023 are challenging not just the American citizenry, but ourselves as federal agents to put the history forward. This badge, as my predecessor used to say, weighs heavy on my shirt today, recognizing the fact that as one of the 2% of Asian American park rangers, this is the one place in our nation's public lands where I see a name just like mine. And I hear this fantastically poignant quote about American history. The first time you see yourself in a history book is as a slave, and you're never going to forget yourself as being a slave in American history. Obviously, this is discussing Black American history and struggle, of course. And I want you all to challenge yourselves in that way. But obviously, you know that because you're here learning about a very sad history in the afternoon, supporting your local museum in this space today. Before I get away from this, are there any questions or comments about terminology and the power of words, specifically on this subject, before I go on to talk a little bit more about Minidoka itself? How many of you are surprised by what's on the screen today? Like you didn't know this before you walked in through the door. It's okay, don't be shy. So yeah, it's okay. Even our fourth grade teacher is like, I didn't know this. Can I ask you, because I'm assuming as a fourth grade teacher, you wouldn't mind speaking out loud in front of people. You ask kids to do it every single day. When you're here in this room, hearing this history, maybe reflecting on your experience, learning about it, what's your reaction? Mm, sure. Thank you. Can I get a round of applause for our local fourth grade teacher, please? That is not an easy job, especially during the recent few years with the pandemic. Anybody have a reaction or a comment in regards to that? I mean, even just the notion of we don't really learn about this. Does anyone have that same thought or feel that same way? Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I will talk to school. I never heard anything about that. I never knew anything about it. So I mean, and I've read about it. So I didn't raise my hand because I knew because I've been out there and read about it. And so I might have even been before I ever even and like you said, there were a lot of Japanese families in our area, and they did not, they were not incarcerated. And many of them were, I mean, we had a lot of respect for the Japanese people in our area. So I went to high school in the late 60s. And, I had a really good friend who was Japanese and just had nothing but respect for it. But she never talked about it. I mean, it was never talked about.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing that. You don't look like you're past 40. You're looking great. Ma'am in the back. And I appreciate you sharing that, ma'am. And I know we have some folks from, we say the community with the capital C, from the Japanese American community. I'd love to put somebody on the spot because these are all my friends. For the folks who are of the community or had family who either went through the incarceration or was affected by it, right? Because once again, if we're in Idaho, it's a little sensitive because there are some folks who wasn't incarcerated but was still affected by it. Did you hear about this at home? I guess is my question I want to start off with. I'm looking at you three in the back, but someone be brave and make me look good, please. Yeah. Thank you for sharing. And I think those stories, maybe didn't have that full impact even today, or maybe it did, and that's why you were a part of that community and continue to preserve a legacy. Yes, and the Heart Mountain shirt, I recognize that shirt. I have the same shirt. It's a fantastic one. Would you mind giving us some more context, please? Well, I appreciate you, Sharon, and I think I appreciate everybody who provided their own personal input. And I think this is the way I'd like to run our Q&A. Maybe it's more as a discussion and it's more of a conversation. I really thank you for being here today and sharing that story. I can't wait to talk to you after the talk is done. But folks, I'm going to continue on and talk a little bit more about Minidoka now that we have a better understanding of the language that we should continue to use to ensure that we don't harm the community that's already been harmed for so long. And that harm looks like this. While this map doesn't give us the full understanding, there was approximately 75 plus different sites of incarceration in which Japanese Americans were incarcerated in. Now, to complicate something I just said back a second ago, yes, there were internment camps, specifically places where only non-American citizen Japanese American, usually men, were taken a week or an hour or a day after Pearl Harbor and separated from their families. And I'll make sure I say that word again, separated from their families, because once again, I think these terms are helpful in us understanding the patterns of history. As they were separated from their families, they were placed into, once again, these specific places called US Army internment camps or Department of Justice camps, where they were taken away and maybe hadn't seen their families for up to 3 years, as my great-grandfather was, a language teacher and a leader in Riverside, California. He missed his son, my grandfather's 8th, 9th, and 10th birthday. And I know we're talking here about civil liberties and civil rights and unjust incarceration, but birthdays, that means something. On the West Coast, you have something that was an exclusion zone that was drawn. Half of Washington, half of Oregon, all of California, the bottom 1/3 of Alaska, Arizona, and yes, even some folks from Alaska. 135 of them were incarcerated at Minidoka. 10 American concentration camps. If you've been to this state, I'd love to see if you could just raise your hand. California. You've been to the state, not saying you're from California. If you've been to California, that's 2 camps there. Manzanar and Tule Lake. Utah, Topaz, Colorado, Amachi, or in the town of Grenada. Arizona, 2 camps, Poston and Gila River on Native American reservation land. A concentration camp inside with another concentration camp. Wyoming, Heart Mountain, and this one will blow your mind. Going all the way down to Alaska, I'm sorry, folks, Arkansas. Anyone been to Arkansas before? In the swamps of Arkansas, 2 camps, Jerome and Rower, where if you're a fan of Star Trek, one George Takei was a young boy when he was incarcerated in a place, Rower, Arkansas. But as you can see here, going all the way across from Hawaii to New York, you have, New Jersey, I guess. You have a really great understanding here of the various types of incarceration that happen. Whether it's within an embassy where folks were not allowed to leave for a set amount of time, or of course, in concentration camps. And sure enough, in the Times News in Twin Falls, words like this, JAPs, 10,000 of them will come to Idaho on Army's orders. And therefore, in August 1942, Minidoka concentration camp opens. It closes in October of 45, in total incarcerating 13,000 people. This aerial view gives you an understanding kind of how large this space was. While it looks very large on this, it was only about 1,000 acres that made the full living space. This residential area from block 1 in the left-hand corner to the top right-hand corner, block 44, was 3 miles long. But of course, these folks did not have a car to drive them. They didn't actually only showed up with only what they could carry. And what they could carry was also limited. No cameras, obviously no weapons. And yes, a baseball bat, if you were a little boy who liked to play baseball, was a weapon. And that was confiscated. That's a story about Secretary Norman Mineta with that story. And of course, no pets. And for a young child, as we consider those 2 young children at the beginning of the story, you can see how something like that might be the memory they hold on to. Over 640 buildings. If you come here today to Minidoka, we have about 5 that tell the story, which means that the story of Minidoka is not found actually in the buildings that are now scattered all the way across this portion of South Idaho, but more so in the farmland, the over 33,000 acres that was designated to be farmland, irrigated, cultivated, and readied for farmsteads by Japanese Americans during those times. The Bureau of Reclamation would hand over this land to the War Relocation Authority with the specific promise that these 13,000 people would create this land from sagebrush and desert to the Magic Valley we know today. Every potato, every carrot, every sugar beet that comes out of the Magic Valley, to some extent, was created because of this forced labor. Idaho did not lose anything in this experience. Idaho only gained. But the farmsteads in the area that were then split up after World War II and given to returning mostly GIs in a land lottery. The idea is that if you serve our country, some of you probably have here in the room bravely, you should get a reward. We should thank you. And white GIs did. Were able to enter to gain 100 to 9 acres of land and 2.5 barracks, which is why we don't have barracks at Minidoka anymore, because they were used in various ways. But if you're a 442nd veteran who bravely served, maybe got a Purple Heart or had various military medals, you wouldn't be allowed to enter that land lottery strictly because of your race. This includes Tuskegee Airmen to Navajo Code Talkers. The landscape of Idaho, at least from this understanding of the Magic Valley, was made by Japanese Americans, at least to some extent by that labor. But let's not forget, folks, that Idaho Falls had a population as well. And this whole general area of south central, southeastern Idaho, mostly coming in originally from the railroads and the rail yards after Chinese Americans were excluded from this land, as local Idahoans would make friends with Japanese Americans. Irving Middle School, I think, is a place around Pocatello. There was a principal there during the war. I think this is stories somewhere right after Pearl Harbor happens. Dan Martin. Anyone here know that name? I don't know him either, but he's in the history book. He's in the history book enough to be able to say, when the white kids on the schoolyard were bullying these young children of Japanese ancestry after Pearl Harbor, he called them all in, all 13 kids in his tiny little school. He says, if anybody gives you trouble at this school, you come straight to me, because you're an American, just like I am. I'm not saying that those stories are many. They're few and far in between. But this notion, at least in Idaho, of Japanese Americans who were living here prior to the war, their experiences may have been influenced by their neighborly colleagues who may have seen them less as the race, but more as the person, but still deeply understanding that for all of us, our racial or religious or sexual identity all make us extremely special and individual. And I think about Idaho Falls and Principal Dan Martin, who stood up for those kids, and how important that must have been in their understanding, comparatively to the kids who were here, who had to go to a civics class and understand what's the difference between freedom in a camp and freedom outside the barbed wire. I know it's kind of hard to see, but I think my front row, folks, I'm pretty sure you can see it. Is there anything on this map here in the legend that surprises you? Look at this and you go, gosh, you're saying the word concentration camp, Kurt, and I don't see it. I see something less of a concentration camp and more of a community. Is there anything that stands out to you on this? I know it's kind of small, my apologies. But okay, military police reminds me more of a concentration camp. Anything that shows you something a little different, a different lens. Swimming pool or swimming hole, what else? Church. Vegetable gardens, anything else? Ball fields, anything else that shows up for you? A theater, yes. Schools and libraries, absolutely. In the operation for the 3 years, this concentration camp, Japanese Americans had to make do and survive. And I ask you, how do you survive an unsurvivable place? Well, you make the best of what you have and you create a community with this general sense that 1/3 or so of the folks who were here, maybe not 1/3 exactly, but a handful of these folks were children, as you could see in the specific pamphlets that I've given you. And considering that a lot of these folks were either young children or folks who were college age who needed to continue their education, you can imagine how the parents, and many of you might be parents or uncles or aunts, would lean on a specific phrase that goes, kodomo no tameni. Kodomo means child. No tameni means for the sake of, or for the sake of the children. And this notion might explain why you would have like a theater where folks may watch a film reel to get a general sense of normalcy on the outside world. You know, and folks, I could speak to you all day. In fact, I actually really much enjoy it. You're a captive audience, both literally and figuratively. But I think some of the best ways to describe this experience is actually through the words of our survivors. So I'm gonna, in my best 9th grade English way, I'm gonna ask some folks to give me some out loud reading, if you wouldn't mind. I see a young boy in a green shirt who I think is a great reader out loud. Now he's so embarrassed. Would you mind, please start with "It is unendurably"? Thank you very much. This next one is a little bit small. I want to forget the day we were herded like cattle into a prison camp. What did we do wrong and what was our crime? This picture at the bottom left-hand corner. Can I get one of the fourth grade teachers, please, if you wouldn't mind, with the glasses? I know you can see really well. Thank you. This last one from Gina Kutsu. I know this story has both war heroes and resistors who fought for American values in the courtroom. And this is one Gina Kutsu who fought and resisted. He says, "I never swore any allegiance to Japan. I've always been an American and pledged allegiance to our flag all my life." And if I had more time, folks, I'd talk to you about this loyalty questionnaire that split this community in part. If I had a little more time, I'd talk a little bit about what that experience must have been like for young children. But I encourage you for those conversations to come to the park and continue to have these conversations with me. But for now, some review. In 1982, and this is, of course, after a decade or so of community organizing from folks like the Japanese American Citizens League and various other people who fought for the realities of what happened, you have a statement like this. "In sum, Executive Order 9066 was not justified by military necessity. The broad historical causes which shaped these decisions were race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. This leads to the Redress and Reparations Movement and the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, in which each person who was alive in 1988 and onward, because it goes across 3 presidents, are given an apology letter and $20,000 as a reparations check. Very different from the $25 in the train ticket you got in 1945. This is one of the few cases, if not the only, in which our country has used the reparations clause within our case of laws here to make a formal apology to a group of American people. This is a big deal. This is a model for how our country can continue to heal. And I want us to do some of that healing today, because the letter and the money are 2 parts of a 3rd piece, which includes education. And thanks to the Idaho Japanese American Citizens League, we have places like Minidoka that are preserved today. Because that public education, which the Museum of Idaho is doing with us today, is the critical 3rd part of the Civil Liberties Act. This idea that we have specifically money set aside in the federal government to continue to tell these stories so that folks like yourselves, caring neighbors in our communities, can recognize that they weren't doing this for their own good, but it really was a failure of leadership. And that it's not that we can't be certain of their prejudice, of their loyalty, but it's actually racial prejudice that caused this to happen. And of course, that the enemy isn't welcome here. And based off of that war hysteria, but I think Idaho Falls citizens, we could all say that the enemy, quote unquote, or the other, are welcomed in your community. Or at least I sure hope you feel that way. I don't think you'd be here if you didn't feel that way. So when you have a chance to visit Minidoka National Historic Site, I encourage you to come join us as a community and a community member of our area. I encourage you to continue to learn more about this history and participate in your local spaces. And to finish off my talk today, I'm going to ask you just one more time. I know it's the summertime and you all are trying not to be students, but here we are nonetheless. I think one of the best ways to make a commitment is to say it out loud together. You don't have to. I know we got some folks who probably at this point are saying, "Gosh, this guy can't stop talking." So I'll stop talking. You can do the talking for me. On the count of 3, I kindly request that the folks joining us on Zoom today can join me in this quote. Think of it as a promise for what you learned about today. It starts with "this is." And I want you to say it with me on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. This is not just a Japanese American story, but an American story with implications for the world. Thank you very much, folks. Please come by and visit us here at the Minidoka National Historic Site Fridays, Saturdays, Sundays. And we also have public tours on Saturdays and Sundays as well. And that's my presentation. And I got 15 minutes for Q&A. Thank you.